the world that never was. History is often remembered through the events that happened. But sometimes, the more fascinating question is what almost happened. In the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany appeared unstoppable. Within weeks, German armies swept across Eastern Europe with astonishing speed. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were captured, and city after city fell to the Wehrmacht. To millions around the world, it seemed only a matter of time before Adolf Hitler achieved total victory. Yet history took a different path. Germany failed to capture Moscow. The Soviet Union survived. For years later, Berlin lay in ruins. But what if just a few key events had unfolded differently? What if the German advance had reached Moscow before the brutal winter of 1941? What if the Soviet government had lost control of the capital? What if the Eastern Front had collapsed? Could Nazi Germany have won the Second World War? This question has fascinated historians, military analysts, and writers for decades. There is no single answer. History is too complex for certainty. But by examining military records, political decisions, industrial capacity, and the realities of the time, it is possible to imagine a world that might have existed. Not a fantasy, not a prediction, but a plausible alternate timeline built upon real historical possibilities. This documentary explores one such scenario. It is important to remember that everything after this point is speculative. The events you are about to see never happened. They represent one possible chain of consequences based on genuine historical conditions and informed analysis. Even the smallest decisions can reshape history. A delayed offensive, a failed counterattack, a harsh winter arriving a few weeks later, a political decision made under pressure. Sometimes entire civilizations have changed because of moments like these. In this alternate timeline, one decision changes everything. During the autumn of 1941, Adolf Hitler abandons his diversion toward Kiev weeks earlier than in real history. Instead, nearly the full strength of Army Group Center is directed immediately toward Moscow. German armored divisions maintain their momentum. The autumn rains arrive later. Soviet defensive preparations remain incomplete. By early October, the Wehrmacht reaches the outskirts of Moscow with far greater strength than it possessed in reality. The battle that follows becomes one of the most decisive moments in human history. In our timeline, Moscow survives. In this one, it does not. The fall of the Soviet capital sends shockwaves across the world. Governments pause. Intelligence agencies scramble for information. Newspapers print headlines that few believe they would ever write. For the first time since the beginning of the war, many begin to wonder whether Adolf Hitler might actually win. And if that happened, what kind of world would emerge? What if Nazi Germany won World War II? The fall of Moscow. October 1941. The air over western Russia was thick with smoke, dust, and the sound of engines. For months, the German Wehrmacht had advanced with astonishing speed, shattering Soviet defenses and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Entire armies had disappeared inside massive encirclements. To many observers around the world, Germany seemed unstoppable. In this alternate timeline, one critical decision changes everything. Instead of diverting large armored formations toward Kiev for several crucial weeks, Adolf Hitler reluctantly accepts the arguments of his senior commanders. Army Group Center remains focused almost entirely on Moscow. Fresh panzer divisions continue east without losing precious momentum. The autumn rains arrive later than expected. Roads remain usable just long enough for German supply columns to keep moving. Fuel shortages still exist, but they never become catastrophic. Repair crews work day and night, keeping damaged tanks operational. The offensive slows, but it never stops. Soviet intelligence quickly realizes the danger. Reports from the front become increasingly desperate. Defensive lines west of Moscow collapse one after another. Refugees flood every road leading toward the capital, carrying whatever possessions they can save. Railway stations overflow with civilians, wounded soldiers, and government officials trying to escape before the city is surrounded. Inside the Kremlin, panic spreads through the highest levels of leadership. Joseph Stalin now faces the greatest crisis of his rule. Some members of the Soviet government urge an immediate evacuation farther east. Others insist that abandoning Moscow would destroy national morale and convince millions that defeat is inevitable. Every hour becomes a struggle between military necessity and political symbolism. The German advance continues relentlessly. Villages surrounding Moscow fall one after another. Heavy artillery can already be heard from the western suburbs. Luftwaffe aircraft dominate much of the sky, attacking railways, bridges, and supply depots. Soviet reinforcements arriving from Siberia are forced into battle before many units are fully organized. For the civilians trapped inside Moscow, life changes overnight. Air raid sirens echo almost without interruption. Windows are covered to hide light from enemy bombers. Anti-tank barricades appear across major streets. Thousands of volunteers dig defensive trenches in frozen ground, hoping to delay the inevitable. Across Europe, newspapers publish enormous headlines announcing that German forces have reached the outskirts of the Soviet capital. Radio broadcasts describe what many believe is the final chapter of the war in the East. Then, after weeks of relentless fighting, the impossible happens. German assault units break through the last organized defensive positions protecting the city center. Street fighting erupts across Moscow. Soviet soldiers defend government buildings, railway stations, and bridges block by block. Every intersection becomes a battlefield. Tanks fire at point-blank range down narrow avenues, while snipers occupy rooftops overlooking shattered streets. The battle lasts for days. Smoke hides entire districts beneath a permanent gray sky. Fires consume factories, apartment blocks, and warehouses. Historic landmarks suffer devastating damage as artillery shells explode across the city. Eventually, Soviet resistance begins to collapse. Government offices are abandoned. Military headquarters relocate farther east. Communication networks fail. German soldiers raise their flags above several important administrative buildings, not as a symbol that the Soviet Union has surrendered, but as proof that its political heart has been struck. Around the world, governments react with disbelief. In London, emergency meetings continue late into the night. In Washington, military planners begin asking whether Germany has become too powerful to defeat through conventional means alone. Even in Tokyo, Japanese leaders quietly reconsider their long-term strategy. Yet beneath the celebrations inside Berlin, another reality begins to emerge. Capturing Moscow is not the same as winning the war. Beyond the burning capital lies a nation stretching thousands of kilometers eastward. Factories continue operating beyond the Ural Mountains. Millions of Soviet citizens remain under arms. Entire industrial complexes have already been dismantled and rebuilt far from the reach of German bombers. The fall of Moscow is a devastating political and psychological blow, but it is not the end. It is only the beginning of a far larger and more dangerous struggle. As winter approaches, both sides prepare for a conflict unlike anything the world has ever seen. Germany has won its greatest victory, but victory itself may prove to be its greatest illusion. A new Europe. The fall of Moscow sends shockwaves across the globe. For the first time since the war began, governments around the world seriously consider a possibility that only months earlier had seemed almost impossible. Nazi Germany may emerge as the dominant power in Europe. In Berlin, the news is greeted with enormous celebrations. Church bells ring across German cities. Newspapers print extra editions announcing what they describe as the greatest military victory in modern history. Propaganda films portray German soldiers as an unstoppable force, while Adolf Hitler addresses the nation from the Reich Chancellery, declaring that history has entered a new era. Across occupied Europe, however, the mood is very different. In Paris, Warsaw, Prague, Amsterdam, Brussels, and countless other cities, people listen to hidden radios in silence. Resistance fighters exchange worried glances. The capture of Moscow does not end their determination, but it changes their expectations. Many begin to fear that liberation may never come. Underground networks continue to operate, though under increasingly difficult conditions. Secret printing presses produce illegal newspapers, sabotage groups target railway lines, and intelligence couriers risk their lives carrying information across occupied borders. Yet every success comes at an enormous cost. German security forces tighten their control, and reprisals become even harsher. Meanwhile, the Soviet government refuses to surrender. Rather than collapse completely, it relocates farther east. Emergency headquarters are established beyond the Ural Mountains, where factories that had already been evacuated continue producing tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and artillery. Millions of workers labor around the clock in freezing conditions, determined to keep the war effort alive. The Soviet Union has lost its capital, but it has not lost its capacity to fight. This surprises many German commanders. Before the invasion, some believed that destroying the Soviet leadership would quickly bring the war to an end. Instead, they discover that geography itself has become one of their greatest enemies. The front now stretches for thousands of kilometers. Supply lines grow longer every week. Fuel, spare parts, winter clothing, and food must travel enormous distances before reaching soldiers at the front. Every kilometer captured creates another kilometer that must be defended. At first, these problems appear manageable. German engineers repair railways and bridges as quickly as possible. Occupation authorities attempt to restore transportation networks. New military headquarters are established across conquered territories. But beneath the surface, cracks begin to appear. Partisan movements grow stronger in forests, swamps, and mountains. Small sabotage operations become daily occurrences. Railway tracks are blown apart during the night. Bridges disappear in carefully planned explosions. Telephone lines are cut. Fuel convoys vanish along isolated roads. No single attack threatens the German army. Together, however, they slowly erode its strength. Far to the west, Britain watches every development with increasing concern. Prime Minister Winston Churchill refuses to accept defeat. In speeches broadcast over the BBC, he acknowledges the gravity of the situation but insists that Britain will continue fighting regardless of events on the Eastern Front. The Royal Navy still dominates the seas. The Royal Air Force continues defending British skies. Across the Atlantic, the United States accelerates military production at an unprecedented pace. American factories expand around the clock, producing aircraft, trucks, ships, and weapons in numbers never before seen in history. Political leaders in Washington now face a difficult question. If Germany has secured control over most of continental Europe, how can that power ever be challenged? Military planners begin discussing operations that only months earlier seemed unnecessary. Massive bomber fleets, new amphibious strategies, expanded cooperation with Britain, greater investment in advanced scientific research. One project receives particular attention, a highly secret program exploring the possibility of creating a weapon unlike any the world has ever known. Few people realize it yet, but the race toward the atomic bomb has become even more urgent. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan observes these events with cautious optimism. German victories strengthen Tokyo's confidence, yet Japanese leaders remain uncertain about opening another front against the Soviet Union. Intelligence reports suggest that, despite losing Moscow, Soviet armies continue to regroup deep inside the country. The conflict is far from over. Back in Berlin, Adolf Hitler becomes increasingly convinced that history has chosen him to reshape Europe forever. Architects begin drafting plans for monumental new capitals. Engineers imagine highways stretching from the Atlantic coast to the distant east. Government ministries prepare ambitious economic projects designed to bind occupied territories directly to the German economy. On paper, the future appears limitless. Reality, however, is far more complicated. Every occupied nation demands soldiers to control it. Every conquered city requires administrators, police, food, fuel, and transportation. Every new victory creates new responsibilities. Germany has built the largest empire Europe has seen in generations. But empires are not measured only by the land they conquer. They are measured by whether they can hold it. And as 1942 approaches, the true test of this alternate world is only beginning. Fortress Europe. By the spring of 1942, Europe had been transformed. From the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of the Ural Mountains, German influence stretched across a continent unlike anything seen before. Railways carried troops and supplies across thousands of kilometers. Military convoys moved almost without interruption. German flags flew over countless government buildings, while occupation authorities attempted to turn conquered territories into permanent parts of a new European order. On maps inside Berlin, the war appeared nearly won. Reality told a different story. Governing such an enormous empire required resources on a scale Germany had never possessed. Millions of soldiers remained deployed far from home. Thousands of tanks required constant maintenance. Aircraft consumed vast quantities of fuel. Railways had to be repaired almost daily after sabotage attacks. Entire divisions found themselves guarding roads, bridges, supply depots, and communication lines instead of fighting at the front. Every kilometer of conquered land demanded another garrison. Resistance movements became more organized than German planners had expected. In the forests of Belarus, partisan fighters attacked isolated convoys before disappearing into the wilderness. In occupied Poland, underground organizations secretly distributed intelligence to Britain. Across France, railway workers deliberately delayed military transports, while hidden resistance cells sabotaged factories producing equipment for the German war machine. These attacks rarely made headlines. Yet together they created a constant drain on German manpower. Every destroyed bridge required engineers. Every damaged railway demanded repairs. Every ambush forced the Wehrmacht to commit more troops to security duties. At the same time, Britain refused to remain passive. Although isolated from continental Europe, it became the center of an expanding alliance. British factories increased aircraft production. New radar systems strengthened air defenses. Long-range bombers began flying deeper into occupied Europe, targeting industrial centers, railway hubs, and oil facilities. Night after night, air raid sirens echoed across German cities. Berlin, Hamburg, Essen, Cologne, and the Ruhr industrial region experienced increasingly destructive bombing campaigns. German civilians who had once believed victory was inevitable now faced blackouts, rationing, and growing uncertainty. Across the Atlantic, the United States transformed into what President Franklin D. Roosevelt had once described as the arsenal of democracy. Shipyards launched new cargo vessels at astonishing speed. Aircraft factories delivered thousands of bombers and fighters every month. Tank production expanded beyond anything Germany could realistically match over the long term. American industrial capacity became the single greatest strategic challenge facing the Reich. German intelligence understood the danger. Reports arriving in Berlin estimated that Allied production would soon surpass German manufacturing in nearly every major category. Even with most of Europe under German control, the economic balance of the war was beginning to shift. Hitler dismissed many of these warnings. Convinced that decisive victories had already secured Germany's future, he believed Allied morale would eventually collapse. His advisors were less certain. Several senior officers quietly questioned whether Germany possessed the resources to fight a prolonged global conflict against both the British Empire and the rapidly expanding industrial might of the United States. Meanwhile, far beyond the Urals, Soviet resistance continued. Entire factories that had been evacuated from Western Russia now operated around the clock. New tank models rolled off assembly lines. Fresh divisions completed training before moving west. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses, but it had not disappeared. Instead, it was rebuilding, slowly, painfully, and on a scale few German planners had imagined possible. By late 1942, the war entered a dangerous new phase. Germany controlled more territory than at any point in its history. Yet beneath that appearance of absolute strength lay growing weaknesses. Fuel shortages became increasingly severe. Replacement vehicles arrived more slowly. Experienced officers were becoming harder to replace. Every offensive consumed resources that could no longer be recovered easily. The dream of a swift and decisive victory had quietly evolved into something Germany had always hoped to avoid. A long war of endurance. And history had already shown that wars of endurance were rarely won by the nation with the largest empire. They were won by the nation capable of producing more, adapting faster, and surviving longer. In this alternate timeline, Germany had conquered Europe. But conquering Europe and keeping Europe were proving to be two very different challenges. The greatest battle of this new world was no longer being fought only on the front lines. It was being fought in factories, on railways, in laboratories, and inside the economies of nations preparing for a conflict that could last for decades. The race for the ultimate weapon. Wars are not won by armies alone. They are won by industry, science, and the ability to innovate faster than the enemy. By 1943, even in this alternate timeline, German leaders understood a difficult truth. Capturing Moscow had changed the course of the war, but it had not guaranteed final victory. Britain continued to resist. The United States was producing weapons at a pace no nation had ever achieved before. And beyond the Ural Mountains, Soviet factories still poured tanks, artillery, and ammunition onto the battlefield. Germany needed something more, something that could restore its strategic advantage. That search led to laboratories rather than battlefields. Across the Reich, scientists worked on projects that seemed almost unbelievable for their time. Engineers refined jet-powered aircraft capable of flying faster than any Allied fighter. Designers improved long-range rockets that could strike cities hundreds of kilometers away. New submarines promised to make the Atlantic even more dangerous. To many Germans, technology appeared to be the key that would unlock total victory. Among these projects, none inspired more speculation than nuclear research. Before the war, German physicists had been among the world's leading experts in atomic science. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 opened the possibility of releasing extraordinary amounts of energy from a single atom. In theory, such research could eventually produce a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Yet theory and reality were very different. In our timeline, Germany never came close to building an atomic bomb. The country's nuclear program suffered from limited resources, competing priorities, organizational problems, and several incorrect scientific assumptions. Many leading scientists had fled Europe years earlier, while others were pushed aside because of Nazi ideology. In this alternate world, however, the situation develops differently. With much of continental Europe under German control, Berlin gains greater access to industrial resources, laboratories, and scientific personnel. Instead of dividing funding among dozens of competing experimental weapons, the government decides to concentrate enormous resources on a handful of strategic projects. Nuclear research receives unprecedented attention. Massive research complexes are constructed under heavy security. Thousands of scientists, engineers, technicians, and industrial workers are assigned to a single objective. Intelligence agencies from Britain and the United States quickly detect unusual activity. Reports describing mysterious uranium shipments, secret laboratories, and heavily guarded industrial sites begin arriving in London and Washington. No one can determine exactly what Germany is building, but everyone agrees on one point. Whatever it is, it cannot be allowed to succeed. Across the Atlantic, the American government responds with even greater urgency. Funding for the Manhattan Project expands dramatically. New research facilities appear almost overnight. Thousands of scientists from around the world work together under extraordinary secrecy, racing against time. Both sides now understand that the future of the war may depend less on armies than on physicists. The competition extends beyond nuclear science. German engineers continue refining the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. New radar systems improve air defenses. Rocket engineers develop increasingly powerful ballistic missiles capable of striking distant targets without warning. Meanwhile, Allied researchers make rapid advances in radar, cryptography, long-range bombing, electronic warfare, and code breaking. The battlefield is becoming a contest of laboratories as much as soldiers. Yet Germany faces a problem that technology alone cannot solve. Every advanced weapon requires factories. Factories require electricity, raw materials, transportation, and skilled workers. Allied bombing campaigns grow larger each month. Industrial districts suffer repeated attacks. Rail networks become unreliable. Oil refineries struggle to maintain production. Engineers discover that designing revolutionary weapons is only half the challenge. Producing them in sufficient numbers is something entirely different. By late 1944, both alliances stand on the edge of a scientific revolution. Each believes that one decisive breakthrough could end the war forever. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that no invention, no matter how extraordinary, can fully compensate for shortages of fuel, manpower, food, and industrial capacity. Technology can change battles. Sometimes it can even change wars. But it rarely changes the fundamental realities of economics. The question facing this alternate world is no longer whether Germany can invent remarkable weapons. It clearly can. The real question is whether those weapons can be produced fast enough before the combined strength of its enemies becomes overwhelming. As the war enters its next phase, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The future of humanity may no longer be decided on the battlefields of Europe. It may be decided inside a laboratory, where a handful of scientists race to unlock the power hidden within the atom. The empire at its greatest extent. By 1948, the map of Europe looked unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. In this alternate timeline, Nazi Germany stood at the center of the largest political and military empire the continent had seen in centuries. From the Atlantic coastline to territories deep in the east, German influence shaped governments, economies, transportation networks, and military strategy. On official maps published in Berlin, the borders of the Reich appeared permanent. Government propaganda declared that a new European order had finally brought stability after decades of conflict. Grand construction projects filled newspapers and newsreels. Architects unveiled enormous plans for redesigned capital cities. Monumental government buildings, vast boulevards, and gigantic railway stations were presented as symbols of an empire that expected to last for generations. To many German citizens living far from the front, the future appeared bright. New highways connected major cities. Factories continued producing civilian goods alongside military equipment. Schools taught that Germany had secured peace through strength. A younger generation grew up believing the victory had been inevitable. But beyond carefully staged propaganda films, reality remained far more complicated. Across occupied Europe, resistance had not disappeared. It had simply adapted. Underground organizations no longer attempted large uprisings. Instead, they focused on intelligence gathering, sabotage, and preserving national identities under occupation. Secret schools taught forbidden languages. Hidden printing presses circulated banned newspapers. Illegal radio operators transmitted information to governments in exile. The war had changed form, but it had not truly ended. Maintaining such a vast empire required enormous resources. Millions of soldiers remained stationed across occupied territories, guarding railways, industrial centers, ports, and government offices. Every occupied city demanded administrators. Every railway required security. Every border needed patrols. Military planners increasingly realized that occupation itself had become one of Germany's greatest strategic burdens. At the same time, the United States and Britain had not accepted the new balance of power. Rather than preparing for peace, both nations continued expanding their military capabilities. Long-range strategic bombers grew larger and more capable. Aircraft carriers projected power across the oceans. New intelligence agencies coordinated operations across multiple continents. Scientific research accelerated at an extraordinary pace. Although open battles had become less frequent, the competition between the world's great powers intensified in other ways. Diplomacy gave way to espionage. Economic influence became almost as important as military strength. Rival intelligence services recruited scientists, military officers, and government officials in an increasingly dangerous contest for information. Historians of this alternate world would later describe it not as lasting peace, but as the beginning of a different kind of global confrontation. A world divided into powerful blocs. A world where every technological breakthrough carried military consequences. A world where no nation fully trusted another. Yet beneath Germany's apparent strength, warning signs continued to grow. Industrial production struggled to keep pace with military commitments. Skilled workers became increasingly difficult to replace. Transportation networks required constant repairs after years of overuse. Economic planners warned that maintaining such an enormous military establishment indefinitely would place tremendous pressure on the national economy. Some senior officials quietly argued that reforms were necessary. Others insisted that any sign of compromise would weaken the authority of the Reich. Internal disagreements, once hidden behind spectacular military victories, gradually became harder to ignore. Even within Germany itself, younger generations began asking questions that older leaders preferred not to answer. How long could such a system continue? Could permanent mobilization truly become a permanent way of life? Could fear alone sustain an empire stretching across an entire continent? These questions had no immediate answers. But history had repeatedly shown that every great empire eventually faced the same challenge. Conquering territory was only the beginning. Governing it, preserving it, and adapting to a changing world were often far more difficult than winning the war that created it. As the 1950s approached, the greatest threat to this alternate Reich no longer came solely from foreign armies. It also came from within, from the immense economic, political, and administrative burden of ruling an empire too vast to control forever. The dream of total victory had been achieved. Now came the far more difficult task of surviving it. The long shadow of victory. Every empire believes it will last forever. Throughout history, powerful civilizations have risen with extraordinary speed, convinced that their dominance would never end. Rome, the Mongol Empire, Napoleon's France, the British Empire, each once appeared unstoppable. Yet history tells a different story. No empire remains unchanged forever. In this alternate timeline, Nazi Germany achieved what many believed impossible. Moscow fell. Much of Europe came under German control. The Reich emerged as the dominant military power on the continent. But victory did not eliminate the fundamental problems that had always existed beneath the surface. Every occupied nation still possessed its own language, culture, traditions, and identity. Resistance movements never truly disappeared. Children who had grown up under occupation became adults with no memory of freedom, but many still dreamed of it. Secret organizations continued to recruit members. Underground newspapers circulated from city to city. Sabotage remained a constant threat. Intelligence agencies across the world quietly supported movements seeking to weaken German control. Maintaining order required an enormous security apparatus. Millions of soldiers and police remained permanently deployed across occupied territories. The cost of sustaining such a system grew year after year. Economists inside Germany began warning that military spending could not continue expanding forever. Resources that might have been invested in housing, education, healthcare, or civilian industry continued flowing toward occupation forces, intelligence services, and weapons development. At the same time, technology transformed the world. Computers became more advanced. Satellites entered orbit. Long-range missiles changed military strategy. Nuclear weapons fundamentally altered the balance of global power. Scientific progress accelerated faster than political systems could adapt. A new generation of Germans, born after the war, viewed the world differently from their parents. Many had never experienced combat. They questioned endless military mobilization. They asked whether permanent occupation could truly guarantee lasting security. Others remained fiercely loyal to the ideals that had built the Reich. Political divisions slowly emerged inside the empire itself. Outside Europe, rival powers continued expanding their own influence. The United States remained an industrial and technological giant. Britain preserved its naval traditions and intelligence networks. New powers emerged in Asia. Global competition increasingly shifted from battlefields to economics, science, diplomacy, and information. Even the strongest military could not solve every problem. History repeatedly demonstrates that empires rarely collapse because of a single catastrophic event. More often, they weaken gradually. Economic strain, political disagreements, administrative complexity, technological competition, resistance from those unwilling to accept foreign rule. These forces accumulate over decades, slowly eroding even the most powerful states. Could the Third Reich have survived for another generation? Perhaps. Could it have remained unchanged forever? History suggests otherwise. Every empire eventually confronts the same reality. The larger it becomes, the more difficult it is to govern. The more territory it controls, the more resources it must dedicate simply to maintaining control. And the more it relies on force alone, the more fragile its foundations often become. This is why historians continue debating the question that inspired this documentary. Could Nazi Germany have won the Second World War? Some argue that different strategic decisions might have prolonged its military successes. Others believe that the combined industrial strength, manpower, and economic resources of the Allied powers would ultimately have prevailed regardless. There is no definitive answer. That is the nature of alternate history. It is not an attempt to rewrite the past. It is an opportunity to better understand why history unfolded the way it did. By exploring paths that were never taken, we gain a deeper appreciation for the decisions, sacrifices, and circumstances that shaped the real world. In reality, Nazi Germany did not achieve total victory. The war ended in Europe in May 1945 with the defeat of the Third Reich after immense human suffering and destruction. The scenario presented in this documentary is fictional, built upon historical analysis and informed speculation rather than actual events. Yet its greatest lesson may not concern Germany at all. It reminds us that history is never inevitable. Every decision, every battle, every leader, and every ordinary person can influence the future in ways impossible to predict. The world we live in today was only one of countless possible outcomes. This was another, a world that never existed, a history that was never written, but one that continues to challenge our understanding of the past. Thank you for watching.